Good evening. Margaret Bourke-White's photographs documented the history of her times, 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. Why did she photograph the inside of the steel factory in the 1920s? How did she happen to be the first Western photographer allowed in Russia in the 1930s? How did she become the first accredited female photographer during World War II, embedded with the troops in Italy, going on bombing missions? And how did she capture the gentleness of the Mahatma Gandhi shortly before his death? Hired as the first female photographer for both Fortune and Life magazines, Bourke-White brought us the photo essay. Entire news stories were told through her crisp black and white photos. A terminal illness shortened the career of this brilliant photojournalist. Now, actor, educator, Sally Matson brings this fearless woman back to life. Here is Margaret Bourke-White in the late 1950s as she looks back on her adventurous career.
I had 5 cameras, 22 lenses, 3,000 peanut flash bulbs, and all of my developing equipment. We had films hanging all over the hotel room. You know, what I really wanted to do, though, this whole time, was to photograph Stalin. So finally, it was arranged by Roosevelt's envoy. I walked in. There was Stalin. He was shorter than I thought, and all pockmarked, not at all what you see on these giant posters all over the country. I said, "Would you like to sit down?" Nothing. I said, "Remember, I photographed your mother in the early 30s, and the interpreter said, 'Your mother, your very mother.'" Nothing. So I gathered up my equipment, and I was just getting ready and dropped this whole pile of bubble flash bulbs on the floor. And as I was crawling around picking those up, he burst out laughing. So I turned around, got my camera, and was able to get this shot with just this bit of a smirk still on his face.
Good evening. We're traveling back in time to the town of Andover in the Massachusetts Bay Colony of New England. The year is 1668, and you have been invited here to meet our neighbor, gentlewoman and poet Anne Dudley Bradstreet. Mistress Bradstreet was born in 1612 to Puritans Thomas Dudley and Dorothy York Dudley. At 16 years of age, she married Simon Bradstreet, and 2 years later, they sailed with the other Puritans to the wild shores and forests of New England. Actor Susan Lenoe portrays the mature Anne as she looks back on her tumultuous life, one in which she raised 8 children, wrote hundreds of pages of poetry, and supported her husband in his public life. Today, Mistress Bradstreet is known as the first poet of New England.
In Ipswich, my poetry took flight, and so did my family. I had my girls, first Dorothy, then Sarah, then Hannah, and in 1640, my second son, Simon. But what of my husband? He was ever in Boston. You see, he was a magistrate on the colony council, and he was never home. Commend me to the man more loved than life. Tell him the sorrows of his widowed wife. My dumpish thoughts, my groans, my brackish tears, my sobs, my longing hopes, my doubting fears. Yes, I began to write letters that were poems to my husband.
Storyteller Katie Green performs a one-person show about Mrs. Mary Rowlandson, a Puritan who lived in Lancaster, Massachusetts during early colonial times. Mary Rowlandson migrated to the Massachusetts Bay Colony with her family as a child in 1630. This was during the Great Migration, when about 20,000 English people came to New England over a 20-year period. The Puritans came for religious reasons with the intention of creating a pure Christian community, the city on a hill. They believed that the native people were savage devil worshippers, and Puritans attempted to convert them to Christianity. This oppression of native people led to the Metacom's rebellion in 1676. This war is also known as King Philip's War, a war that historians claim to be the most devastating one ever fought in our country. Mary Rowlandson and her children were held captive during this conflict, as were many others. After her release, Mary Rowlandson wrote about her experience. Her narrative, originally published in 1682 as The Sovereignty and Goodness of God, was the first bestseller in American literature. It has never been out of print. Katie Green performs Mary Rowlandson's story to encourage people to explore and discuss issues that are still relevant today: theocracy, racism, and the seeds of war.
The savages took me up to George's Hill, and there I sat on a snow and ice-covered rock, holding my bleeding child. And I had nothing to comfort her. I could see the smoke rising over Lancaster. I heard later that 40 men had come from Marlborough, but they arrived too late. They came just in time to see the village burning and to bury the dead. It was just as the Most Reverend Increase Mather of Roxbury said. Those savages were placed here by God to punish us for leaving the scriptures. When they painted their faces black, they jumped up and down and they hooted and hollered. They killed all of our livestock. It was piled up, some roasting on a fire, and all of our work going to feed our enemies.
It is said that polite women rarely make history. Imagine what it would be like to live around 1900, when girls were expected to be perfect little ladies and young women's only option was to be a wife. Girls today might find it a little restricting. As a young woman, Juliette Gordon Low gave and attended many parties, and here it was, and also in England. Then in her 50s, she started to do something and wanted to be useful. Eventually, she discovered scouting and began challenging girls to find their talents. She made history by founding the Girl Scouts of America. It is 1920. Mrs. Juliette Low, better known as Daisy, played by actor-playwright Kate Carney, has had a revelation when she challenged girls to do things no one thought girls could or should do. She discovered the real meaning of her life.
Oh my goodness, you girls are all wearing long pants. Well, where are your skirts? Why aren't you wearing skirts? When I was a girl, we had to wear dresses and behave like perfect little ladies so that we would grow up into perfect young ladies whom a man would want to marry. Oh, but I see what you're doing. You're the reason you're wearing those pants is because you're tomboys. Well, I was one too. I climbed trees, I caught frogs, and I stood on my head with my skirt tucked carefully between my knees. But then I had to start taking lessons in social graces, and then the parties started, and they went on and on.